Hello and welcome to this webinar, which is brought to you by West Mercia Police in association with Project Edward, and that stands for Every Day Without a Road Death, as well as the Older Drivers Forum. My name is James Luckhurst, and in the next hour or so, we'll be doing our best to equip you and your family members with lots of information and knowledge designed to help you stay safe as a driver, but also we'll consider some of the issues that can affect our driving as we get older. And where possible, we'll discover what we might be able to do that will boost our driving safety. Helping us to do this is Rob Hurd, Chair of the National Older Drivers Forum and a highly experienced advocate for senior road safety. He was a police officer for more than 30 years, and just a few months ago, he received an MBE for his services to road safety. We'll also hear from a doctor specialising in geriatric issues, as well as a West Mercia police sergeant who'll explain how the law has been developed to stop people from driving if they need to take particular medicines that can impair their judgment. And with diabetes on the rise, we'll understand why it's very important to know how this can affect your driving and what you can do if you have either type 1 or type 2. There'll also be time towards the end to discuss the questions you ask and the points you raise. All you need to do is pop your questions into the Q&A box that you'll find on your screen, and we'll do our best to cover as many as we can. First up then, let's meet Rob Hurd from the Older Drivers Forum to explore the subject of safer driving in later life. Let's start then, Rob.
Hello,
Welcome to
James.
the webinar. What are the most common safety challenges that older drivers face on the roads today? And how do these differ from those faced by younger drivers?
Well, we know older drivers have a wealth of experience, tolerance, and confidence, but sometimes as we age, our hearing, reaction time, judgment and speed and distance aren't always as good as it always used to be. And we know certainly as we age, fragility is one particular issue. If we are involved in a collision, it can take us much longer to recuperate it from younger drivers. Now, many people often wonder why we actually are focusing sometimes on older drivers. Well, when we look at the stats between younger and older drivers, we know that young drivers are often those risk takers. Whereas as we age, sometimes it can be us with complacency or sometimes medical conditions that may affect us as well and our frailty. And in fact, young driver fatalities have actually been decreasing over the last 10 years by 24%. Whereas unfortunately, we've been seeing older driver fatalities increasing by about 19% over the last 10 years. So it really shows that we need to focus on it. Now, there are some real characteristics of older driver incidents, which are the issues with them. We know that they need more time to process information. Our brains are a little bit slower in processing things and predicting hazards. We know we're less likely to speed, but also more likely to be involved in a clash, particularly a right-of-way violation. And when I'm talking about turning right from a junction, that seems predominantly where most collisions occur with older drivers. And then also having difficulty merging into fast moving traffic, which is why often older drivers avoid things like motorways and fast dual carriageways as well. And we know sometimes our visual abilities to search properly when we come to a junction could be reduced. But ultimately, there's no set age that we need to retire from driving. We all age differently. We've got drivers in their 40s no longer fit to drive. We've got drivers in their hundreds perfectly fit to drive. So we just always need to bear in mind as an individual what we are.
Well, I can remember being driven just last summer by somebody who was 102, and I'm pleased to say that he has just renewed his own license, which you have to do every 3 years after the age of 70. So he's now done it for the 12th time, which isn't
Fantastic.
bad going. But that isn't, not everyone is as fortunate as that. So let's just look at the main reasons for why older people are vulnerable and how perhaps they can mitigate the risks.
Yeah, so as I said, the main issue often, if we are involved in a collision as we get older, it's that frailty, that particular thing. Those sudden forces on the body can end up making, our bones are not so uh, rubber, they're more brittle, much more likely to break. And also, our muscles and ligaments aren't as strong as they used to be. So, therefore, when we are involved in a collision, we can sometimes put us, even a minor collision, put us in a hospital, which could take some time to recuperate. And sometimes, unfortunately, could lead to much more serious outcomes as a result of it. Now, most importantly, there really are kind of four simple things that we can actually do to try and make sure that we are safe. And particularly, I would say when we come in to renew our license, we're ticking those boxes to say we're fit and healthy to drive. Like James was saying, at the age of 70, it's every 3 years, unless we've got a medical condition. It could be every year, depending on those conditions. So first thing that we'd always encourage people to do is actually speak to your doctor and pharmacist, just to make sure that any medication and any illness that you have, are you perfectly fit to drive with that? Now, like I said, there are about 286 notifiable medical conditions, and at license renewal, we're only asked about 15. So it's important that we recognise what those conditions are and actually inform the DVLA, because we know a large number of people with notifiable medical conditions of all ages have failed to inform the DVLA. Now, if you're not sure where they are, we have on our website, Auto Drivers Forum, got a page called Medicine and Inform the DVLA, and you've got all the details about where you can find those particular medical conditions. The other thing is talking about voluntary driving assessment. Great way of just refreshing that complacency that we sometimes will get with our driving, bad habits as well. And we'll be talking about that a lot more on Thursday's webinar that we're going to do. So if you want to know about voluntary assessments, come and watch our webinar on Thursday. Now, the other last thing is regular eyesight tests. We need to be able to see the hazards to react to it. So that's one thing we'd recommend.
With eyesight in mind, Rob, we should turn our attention in more detail to that vital issue, and I'd like us now to watch a short video that illustrates the risk.
Next time you get behind the wheel of a car, just take a moment to check you meet the minimum eyesight standard for driving. By ensuring your vision is roadworthy, you'll be helping to reduce the 3,000 fatal and serious injury collisions that occur every year on our roads just because of poor eyesight. So when did you last have an eye test? Can you read a number plate 20 meters away? You did on your driving test, but how long ago was that? If you're reluctant to check your vision, then be aware of the harsh penalties for dealing with people whose defective eyesight causes collisions. 82-year-old Peter Gardner was sentenced to 6 months in prison in September 2022 after driving into the back of cyclist Jim Tassell in Hampshire. Jim died in hospital 5 days later. Tests revealed Gardner failed to read a number plate at 20 meters distance. In fact, it was only when he was 3 meters away that he managed to read it. Jim Tassell's daughter Emma Damon explains what Gardner's recklessness has put their family through.
The heartbreak and the sense of loss, it's indescribable what he has done to us. My dad, he was the kingpin of our family, and to have that taken away from you so quick, you had no idea, just to get that phone call and then, oh my gosh, and then to see Dad and then to be told that he wasn't going to get better.
A lengthy investigation led to Gardner being charged in Crown Court with causing death by careless driving. Sergeant Spencer Ragg led the investigation. He explains what powers the police have to test driver eyesight.
We will routinely carry out eyesight tests on people either post-accident to see whether that has been a contributory factor in that accident occurring, which obviously proved to be the case in this incident. Or actually, if we stop someone and we believe that their eyesight might be impaired or defective, then actually we can carry it out. Subsequently, if we find people's eyesight isn't up to the required standard, then we would inform the DVLA and have their licence revoked, and that can be almost instantaneously.
Rob Hurd is founder and chair of the Older Drivers Forum.
Research has shown that around about 10% of all motorists driving on the road at any time have defective eyesight and below the legal limit. That's actually around about 3 million people driving on our road at any time with defective eyesight. Shocking stuff. And as we well know, that 90% of all driving information is visual. So it's so important that we continue to have our sight checked to make sure we have perfect vision to be safe on the road. And unfortunately, with Mr. Tassell's situation, that didn't happen on that day. A driver drove on the road with defective eyesight and unfortunately brought about the untimely death of Mr. Tassell.
There's a clear message for anyone willing to take a risk by driving with defective vision, as Rob Hurd makes clear.
There's a small minority who drive on our roads knowing or just don't bother checking their sight, and they are the ones causing the risk. Are you that person? Are you someone suffering from that? Please do not take that risk. Go and get your sight checked and make sure that you are safe on the road
so you can protect yourself, your family, and other people.
No one wants to give up driving, and there's lots of support to help us stay on the road for longer. But safety has to be the priority, and getting an eye test is a vital way you can reduce risk and help make the roads safer.
That was the report on the importance of vision and driving. Rob, remind us then, Rob Hurd, how do age-related changes in eyesight, hearing, and reaction time impact our driving ability, and what practical steps can older drivers take to compensate for these changes?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the video there, 90% of driving is visual. So we need to be able to see a hazard to be able to react to it. And unfortunately, many people, we MOT our cars regularly, but how often do we actually MOT ourselves? Make sure that we are fit and healthy to drive. So we would always recommend a regular eyesight test, at least every 2 years for all of us. I genuinely feel over the age of 70, maybe we should be considering it every year, but get the advice from your optometrist. Now, don't always rely on just a 20-meter number plate test, okay? We need to make sure that we can be able to properly see with our acuity, peripheral vision, and contrast sensitivity. Now, we know as we age, our sight does deteriorate, quite gradually. It's something that happens. And quite often we don't notice those changes. So we're always saying by having a regular eyesight test, we can pick up those things and make sure that any issue that we've found can be treated early, which often allows us to carry on driving much longer as a result of it as well. In fact, my mother was diagnosed from multiple sclerosis as a result of an eyesight test. She'd not been well for a while, went to the optometrist, they identified something, and it allowed her to be treated much earlier, so it allowed her to continue driving much longer as a result of it as well. Now, like I said in there, about 5 to 10% of people on the road at any one time would fail the eyesight test, So think about it, 100 cars going past you. If we had 5 or 10 of those cars couldn't read the eyesight test, and a car's a lethal weapon. We need to be safe and fit on the road. So always big important thing as we age, regular eyesight test, really important, not only for our health, but also our vision as well.
And do you have details of the legal requirements and the best practice in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to share you some slides which actually just will actually highlight that to you. So when we're looking at eyesight, older drivers, we often know will avoid driving at night. We know that is an issue. Basically, it's the rods and cones in our eyes are like muscles. As we age, they start to not be as quick in reaction. So quite a lot of older drivers, as we age, they will sort of self-regulate from driving at night, which is a perfectly sensible thing to do. And in fact, at the age of 15, if you're blinded by a set headlight, it will take you about 2 seconds to go back to being normal again. Whereas the age of 65, it can take up to 9 seconds. Now, this means that we need to make sure that our sight is suitable from that. Now, often when driving at night, we do get lots of questions from different people about problems from this glare situation. Now, what I will say, we have some videos on our website, Older Drivers Forum website. In there, there's a little link at the top to videos. And one of those is about driving at night and some safe tips about driving at night. Kind of basically, if you are about to be glared out by a set of headlights, look at the white line at the side and then look back again once the glare's gone, because we know it can take a time. Now, a lot of people are asking us, how about wearing yellow filters on my glasses? Now, those are fine. They make everything look a bit brighter, but you need to be aware of that contrast change, because when we're looking at traffic lights like a red, amber, green, they often will be grayed out and look exactly the same. So it's always important that we bear that in mind if you're going to use those yellow glasses. Now, also, another really good tip to you is get that anti-reflection coating on your glasses. This is sort of really crucial for night driving, we feel, and it minimizes glare and also the reflections that we can often get at night from headlights and various things as well. But it also enhances visibility and contrast. But what I would say is have a chat with your optometrist to make sure what's best for you. Now, when we look at the legal requirements for driving, basically, medical conditions that may affect us. 33% of people over the age of 40 are affected by these conditions. One, glaucoma. We lose our sort of peripheral vision. That's glaucoma, and severe glaucoma. Macular degeneration. We get age-related macular degeneration, which often means we will lose our central vision. And then we get things like cataracts. Now, a lot of people, cataracts will creep up on us without us being aware of it. It's a bit like many people would describe it as having like a lace curtain in front of you. dulls all the colours. Once they've had the cataract removed and had a new lens put in, it's amazing people find how much colour. But this creeps up, so a regular eyesight test would pick up on that. And then we have blindness as well. Now, most people who are blind can actually see some light and dark colours, depending. It's a bit patchy sometimes, like we see on there. So a regular eyesight test can often pick up some of these little things before they start getting bad. So what are the legal requirements for driving? So the standards of vision for driving, these are what they basically are, all right? An individual must be able to read a number plate at 20 meters. That's the minimum distance that all of us must be. And we often, when we renew our license, have to tick a box to say that. We must also meet what we call the 612 on the Snellen scale, which is that middle section there as well. And also, we must have an adequate field of vision, which is about 120 degrees. Okay, so these are the 4 things that we need to make sure that we hit the standards of vision for driving. So when you tick that box to renew your license, that's what you're saying you can do. Yes, that you can read a number plate at 20 meters, but we can't check those other 2 unless we go to an optometrist. So make sure we have a regular eyesight test is the most important thing that we can do in relation to that.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Now, let's take a moment to get some practical tips on staying healthy. Dr. Amanda Kilsby is a specialist in geriatric medicine and a consultant at the Newcastle upon Tyne Hospital. And as Amanda sets out, keeping active is key.
I think that regular exercise can keep you from deteriorating with many of the things that can happen. So, for example, if you don't do regular exercise, your muscle power will decrease. You may lose fine motor movements that you might otherwise be able to keep. And for example, if it's a ball sport like tennis or golf, you may well keep your visual acuity and your sort of motion detection more effective for longer. Your eyesight can be affected by all sorts of different parts of your body. It's not just the eye itself, but it's also the brain. So for example, if you've had a stroke, you can end up not being able to see one side of your visual field. That can impact on how you drive, but of course, depending on the size of the deficit that you're left with, it may actually mean that you're still a safe optician. If you're presenting with something that seems more like a medical problem, then the optician will refer you to the doctor. But the most important thing is to tell somebody. If you do have any symptoms that make you think that you might have dementia, or if you have a diagnosis of dementia, the most important thing is that you describe what you're having and that you talk to somebody about it as early as possible. The main thing, whether you have dementia or any other condition that might affect your driving, is that you tell somebody, go and seek medical advice as soon as you have any symptoms. There are preventative measures that we can put in place to prevent the progression of some conditions like worsening of eyesight or dementia. And the other thing is that we can try and make a plan to make you live a long and healthy life and stay behind the wheel for as long as possible.
That was Dr. Amanda Kilsby. Now, just a reminder, you're watching a webinar on safer driving for seniors, and I'm James Luckhurst. For our next section, we're considering impairment. In other words, the drugs and medicines that can affect your ability to drive safely. Rob Hurd is staying with us, Rob from the Older Drivers Forum, but I'm pleased to welcome Sergeant Steve Broom from West Mercia Police. Steve, you're very welcome along to the webinar. Just tell us a bit about how police officers can determine if someone is unfit to drive because of drugs.
Thank you. Yeah, so the law changed for us in 2016 and gave us the power to test people at the roadside for a whole host of drugs, in particular cannabis and cocaine, with drug wipes. These are little COVID-style tests that we take a saliva sample from somebody, and if it detects either of those in their system, then they're arrested for a blood test. Apart from that, there are now 17 different drugs with a prescribed limit that we can detect in a blood test, which will result in a disqualification or more severe penalties.
What are some of the consequences then if a drug-impaired driver causes a serious collision or a fatality?
The law's been changed and it has really sort of ramped up in this field. So ultimately, the most serious offence that we have on the statutes is causing death by dangerous driving. there is now causing death by dangerous driving whilst over a specified drug limit, and you can get a life imprisonment for that, which is obviously a very severe penalty as you can get.
And just talk about some of the other things, a conviction for drug driving, what effect would that have on a driving record or ability to get insurance and the kind of consequences in that regard?
Yeah, well, we obviously know the insurance companies take a big interest in any sort of convictions, in particular drug driving, and these convictions can stay up to sort of 11 years on your record. But we find with some repeat drug drivers that we get on the roads, what normally is a 12-month disqualification on the first offence will then be an 18-month and a 3-year disqualification if they're caught within that period of 5 years. And as police officers, we will keep a record of this indefinitely. So we target repeat offenders. But it'll have severe impact, not only on the insurance and all the rest of it, but socially, on your family, employment. It's quite a far-reaching sort of offence, really.
And I believe that the penalties, the legal penalties, are the same for driving whilst unfit or over the limit of a medicinal drug as for a what you might call an illicit or recreational drug. Am I right in that?
Yeah, no, that's right. So there was pre-existing legislation called Section 4, whilst driving whilst unfit through drink or drugs, which still remains, and our officers are trained to recognise that and can conduct what we call fit tests at the roadside, and the penalties are exactly the same, whether it's a prescription drug or an illicit drug. If you are unfit to drive, the penalties are exactly the same.
Talk me through a fit test. What does fit stand for and what happens?
Yeah, so it's a field impairment test. Officers on our traffic department are trained to do these things. In essence, if you sort of could imagine, if you ever see American police officers stop people at the side of the road, getting them to touch their nose, etc., it's a scientific version of that. So we examine people's eyes. This what's called a Romberg test, where we get people to close their eyes and imagine 30 seconds. We do a walk and turn, one leg stand, put your finger to your nose, etc. And that's all completed on what we call an MGDDF form, and it's an interpretation of how people respond to all these tests will stand up in court as being unfit. That'll get you arrested, and we will take either a blood or a urine sample. And if any sort of drugs are detected, then that's the same conviction as if you're found over for an illicit drug, in essence.
And I suppose it's no defense if you have a valid prescription. If you're over the limit driving, then that's the offence stands.
Absolutely. So of the 17 drugs that I mentioned that we've now got a prescribed limit for, half of them are actually prescription drugs. I appreciate this can be quite confusing, alarming, worrying for people. In essence, you need to speak to your GP if you are showing any of the signs of being unfit or impaired by those medication, then you shouldn't be driving. And sadly, quite often we get into this scenario after there's been a collision, and we'll conduct one of these tests, and that's when it is apparent.
Sergeant Steve Broom, thank you so much for talking to us. Do stay with us, and we'll have a look at some questions from our audience members a little bit later in the webinar. But if I can bring Rob Hurd back in. Rob, as we age, we often sort of end up taking medication regularly. So what particular drugs may cause us problems?
So any medication, as Steve was saying, can lead to you driving adversely. And the ones most likely to have an impact, especially as we're older, the drugs that we might regularly be on are things like drugs for anxiety, sometimes antidepressants, products containing codeine is an important one to remember. The cat can be a very strong drug for us. Some cold and allergy remedies. People often don't think that might make you unfit for driving. Tranquilizers, sleeping pills, and pain relievers. That's where the codeine comes in again. So those are some important drugs that we need to look at and make sure that those are the ones that we could cause us problems, and make sure we read the information properly and check with your pharmacist to make sure that they don't contradict with any medication you're currently on.
What are some of the reactions to look out for in taking a drug that might affect us?
Yeah, so exactly as I said, we need to make sure we check that it's okay with our pharmacist or GP to take those particular drugs. But because we often find a combination of drugs as we age often can make a different reaction than just taking that drug alone. And therefore, the things that we need to look out for if we are a driver and we're taking certain drugs is, are you particularly feeling more sleepy or drowsy? Is someone mentioning that to you? Have you got perhaps a little bit of blurred vision with it? Some dizziness when you're getting up? Are you sometimes feeling more dizzy than you would normally feel? Do you feel that your movements are a little bit more slower and relaxed? Have you started fainting with something? Or maybe the inability, someone's noticed your inability to pay attention, or sometimes nausea as well. Now, if we're getting any of those, then I would recommend that we don't drive and that we speak to our GP and pharmacist.
Finally, for this section, Rob, sometimes people share medication.
Yes.
They think it's okay to take someone else's medicine. What's your advice in relation to that?
Well, firstly, it needs to be remembered that it is illegal. If you've been prescribed a drug, to share it with someone or then take it yourself, it is actually illegal, and you could be prosecuted for things like possession with intent to supply, or possession with a controlled drug, or even fraud, I mean, or misrepresentation. So, really importantly, it is illegal. Now, secondly, there are some really serious health risks in actually sharing prescribed drugs. First is those negative reactions. Now, different people react differently to drugs, and your GP will know what works for you. Incorrect dosage. The GP or your pharmacist has particularly given you that dosage depending on you, your size, your weight, and other issues that you've got. So therefore, taking something which the incorrect dosage could actually lead to an overdose, drug toxicity, can't even get it out, or even serious injury or death. And then there's drug interactions. For example, if you take a drug, that person who's given it to you, I mean, they may not be taking a certain drug. And when you combine those two drugs, it may make a completely different effect. And then there's also the factor that actually, if you've got an issue that you're taking that drug for from someone else, actually, it's better to go to the doctor and get that treated early, because it could actually delay proper treatment that actually could solve that problem and not make it become more serious.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's now time to turn our attention to the topic of diabetes. And I had the opportunity a couple of days ago to speak to Kate Walker from the Diabetes Safety Organisation. I first asked her about the main ways diabetes could impact an older person's ability to drive safely.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, the important thing always that we want to say is that when diabetes is well managed, there are a lot less complications and risks. And I think that's the key thing. As we get older, diabetes sadly is a progressive disease, and over time it can worsen, which can lead to problems with sensation in feet, eyesight issues. It leads to heart attacks and strokes. But the better diabetes is managed, the less risks there are. So that's the thing that we want to highlight all through this is real well managed diabetes, i.e. the blood sugar levels are kept within healthcare professionals' recommendation is pivotal. But yes, we do see rises in risks because over time the body may have had more impact from diabetes and that damage is starting to happen. Whereas I say eyesight, feet, and other complications start to pose a risk for those on the roads and driving with age.
I suppose I should have asked first off, but just give us a kind of quick rundown of actually what diabetes is.
Yeah, good one. Yeah, great idea. So around diabetes, fundamentally, diabetes is when the body can't manage sugar anymore. So if we eat something sugary, our blood sugars rise. If we don't have diabetes, we produce insulin and pull the blood sugars down nice and safely. If someone's living with diabetes, what happens is when their blood sugar rises, the body either doesn't produce enough insulin or it's not as good at insulin, so the blood sugar stays higher. That's for type 2s. Type 1 is an autoimmune condition. The body doesn't produce any insulin. It has to be self-regulated. So currently there's about 5 million people here in the UK with diabetes. 1 million are undiagnosed, and 5%, about 5 million, so about 400,000 have type 1. The rest predominantly are type 2. There's a few other conditions, but for today's conversation, we'll stick to those sorts of numbers.
Let's talk about diabetic neuropathy or vision problems and how they can affect driving abilities in older adults.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a really good kind of two key areas. So over time, the damage that gets done from those high blood sugars is onto nerves. So neuropathy is damage to nerves, whether that's in our hands or our feet, but we particularly talk about peripheral neuropathy, diabetic peripheral neuropathy around the feet. So there's lack of sensation can happen under the bottom of the foot. And so we start to see more either full on or full off acceleration, and or we don't know where the foot is in space. So pedal confusion as well of whether it's accelerator or brake. So there's two kind of key factors around that. And 50% of people living with diabetes suffer from peripheral neuropathy at some point during their lifetime. So it is a high percentage. And sadly, it just creeps on. We don't notice when our trousers get a little bit tight. The same, we might not notice that sensation or lack of sensation in the feet. And then with our eyes, it's the same. There's damage behind the eyes. We need to ensure that people are getting their full eye tests every year when required. And also just that we understand that it's the leading cause of blindness in the working population. And we've talked over time that damage works. And this is why there's a greater risk for people who are of an older age when it comes to diabetes and driving.
So just remind us of what kind of how it would manifest itself, these diabetic neuropathy. Where would we see that happening? Where would we suddenly think, actually, that might be something that I need to be aware of?
Yeah, really good. I think ideally where we'd like to see it is that we check our feet. And one of the things that we're starting to produce is some guidance around driving for individuals with diabetes, and checking your feet before you get in a vehicle, like we would check other things, are our tires up to scratch, everything else. I think so. Ideally, we love that people are checking the base of their feet. If they've got diabetes, they should have yearly annual reviews of their feet, and they have the right to go and make sure they're having that. So I think that would be preferable before we get behind the wheel. But where we would see it, I suppose, in reality on the roads is that harsh braking, harsh accelerating, wrong pedal, and as you say, potentially near collisions, near misses, and those moments that the passenger might be a little bit more like, oh, what happened here? That jolt jerk kind of reaction could be, there may be other factors, but it could be contributed to from peripheral neuropathy or diabetic peripheral neuropathy.
So let's keep things practical. Steps that an older driver with diabetes can take before and during a journey to reduce the risk of a diabetes-related driving incident.
First and foremost, get yearly screenings and checks both for feet, eyes, and general health and MOT checks for diabetes. They're in part of the system with the NHS. It's all accessible and available. Once behind the wheel, I think, and even actually before behind the wheel, maybe doing daily checks on your feet with a little spool under the feet. Are there any sensations or any spots where you can't feel anything? Because it can be over time and gradual. So just a quick check. And we know our eyes, if we've just got to have that self-honesty to keep ourselves and others safe on the roads, and have that vigilance that we want to be doing that for others, and empathy. I think in the driving situation, I think it's about self-awareness, noticing that change in lack of smoothness in the driving and what that could be, or close misses, which we know are happening. I think it's very challenging, isn't it? We all want to keep our independence. I think there's total recognition that that is a real big challenge as we age, that we want to be able to still have our vehicles and still be able to get around. So I think it's that honesty with ourselves when we're there, or family members can support with these more challenging conversations and what that could look like. But certainly if it's feet, there are opportunities where people use hand pedals and other options, and adjustments can be made to the vehicle. So I think it's really important to say there are options available that means that they won't have to come out of the car, and actually doing that can make them safer and the roads safer too, and family members.
Your mention of family members is important. Do you have some tips on how they may be able to approach conversations about driving safety with an older relative who has diabetes, especially if they are specifically concerned about their ability to drive safely, and they feel that they might be, at a much higher risk?
I think this is always challenging. I think everyone who's been in those positions know. I think massive amounts of empathy. I think a lot of reassurance that there are alternative solutions, especially around feet, that there's hand pedals and things that can be done. So I think it's empathy and recognition of what that's going to make them feel, that real potential risk of isolation, those challenges. So I think it's a gentle conversation. I think it's recognition actually as well. When we're starting to see peripheral neuropathy and other eye complications, it's often that diabetes isn't being well managed. So I think there's a bigger picture that can come in here. I'm concerned for your health. This really matters to me. We want to keep you healthy and well as long as we can. If your diabetes is high, it's not just driving, there's a whole health. How do we ensure you don't go down a route of heart attack and other complications? So I think that can come in, that empathy, and giving them the opportunity to understand there's alternatives so that we're not taking them out of the car necessarily as a first port of call, or that they've been, punished or restricted in a way that can feel harsh at that age.
So, some advice then. What advice would you have for older drivers with diabetes regarding DVLA regulations, the importance of reporting certain conditions or incidents?
We do absolutely need to be able to report both to DVLA, and also some insurers require certain information as well. I think it's important to check. So it's not as straightforward. So anyone on insulin, that is straightforward. There's 1 million in the UK now, 600,000 people with type 2 diabetes are on insulin. So anybody who's on insulin must report to DVLA that they are on insulin and they can manage it well. There are now monitors. There's some really nice, really some cool tech coming out that's going to be able to help families manage it better and keep people in range. So I think you need to just check DVLA individually, or family members need to check and ensure that they are reporting that, and to insurers if required as well.
A quick look then. Let's focus a bit more on the technology that's coming. These continuous glucose monitors, life changing, potential game changers, I suppose.
Absolutely game changers. So one of the difficulties we see is a lot of people hold their blood sugars high to ensure they don't have the hypos, that low blood sugar drop that can cause someone to lose a license quite quickly if they happen a lot. So people run their bloods high, and it's that high blood running that causes these complications. Suddenly, if we get these arm monitors and these new continuous glucose monitors that we're seeing, people can keep their blood sugars in range much more safely, because it alerts when it's going low or it alerts when it's going high. We don't have to get to the place of a hypo or a hyper. So people can manage their blood sugars much more beautifully, more balanced to the healthcare professionals with less risk. And so overall, their body will not kind of go into these complications and the difficulties that actually are really the biggest challenges around diabetes.
I tell you what, I was really impressed, and this is nothing to do with technology. A family friend was talking about an incident at their house in the middle of the night where eldest daughter, who's about 17 and is type 1 diabetic, her hypo was, the alert for her hypo came from the family dog, who was scratching on her bedroom door because the dog could smell something. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. I've heard a few stories, and someone else I know has got their dog is very acutely aware of their blood sugars. And they're actually training some dogs now as well to do that. So yeah, it's extraordinary that can be picked up, and what a wonderful opportunity to have a closeness with an animal as well. And would be great for an older person potentially to have company.
Well, look, we better draw things to a close. Tell me about the resources or support services available for families and older drivers with diabetes who might be struggling with the decision to continue or to stop driving.
Absolutely. There's a lot of information out there, particularly Diabetes UK is our largest charity in the UK. They have some fantastic information. We're just bringing out some guidance on what to look for around checking the body around before we drive, like we would check a vehicle. And we can certainly share any of those resources in the coming months. And I think it is about also consulting with GPs and healthcare professionals, because they also do know exactly what's going on, and they can support a family member through this as well.
That was Kate Walker from Diabetes Safety. Now let's continue our conversation with Rob Hurd from the Older Drivers Forum. We have time to take advantage of Rob's expertise as we consider a number of relevant topics, not just for us as drivers, but to our family members, and the importance of providing support and advice. Rob, what are the first signs family members should look out for that might indicate an older driver's safety is at risk? And how can they distinguish between normal aging and perhaps more serious driving concerns?
Yeah, I think if you are looking at someone and you're noticing that that person's becoming more anxious about driving. Now we know that is sometimes as we age, sometimes we're not doing as much driving as we used to, so therefore we might become a little bit more anxious. But when it's getting over anxious, is a time to consider things. Maybe you've looked at the car, there's some extra scrapes, dents, various different things. Maybe they've had a few more regular collisions and they're saying, "Oh, it just happened. This happened." That might be an indication something else is going on, need to be looked at more importantly. Also, maybe if you in your mind are more uncomfortable about them now, if it's they're looking after the grandchildren, doing a regular grandchildren ride, maybe that's something to consider as well. And also, if the partner of that person, maybe if the wife or the husband, is out in the car with them and they're uncomfortable and they're finding that they're scary moments and they're mentioning it to you, that could be a time. But each family situation is unique in different persons' personalities and their knowledge and lack of knowledge of what the road safety things are. So it's always important that we address things as soon as they arrive rather than leave them to fester.
Now, conversations about driving can be sensitive and obviously quite emotional. What strategies do you recommend for family members to approach these discussions empathetically, if that's the right word, and constructively, especially when the older driver perhaps is reluctant to talk about giving up?
Yeah, and I think that's a really big question. And I think the most important thing is to have those conversations with people, but they need to be prepared for. So the way we always look at this is who, when, what. That's what we're looking at. So when we look at who, identifying in the family who is maybe the best person to have that conversation, rather than the person who's the strongest personality, you would just say, "Dad, Mum, you need to stop driving." That may be not the right person. It may be need to be more a compassionate person, the person who they listen to more or more likely to have a general conversation in a nice, friendly atmosphere. But also experience works as well. Somebody who's got a bit of experience where that person would respect their experience in that subject. So identify who would be the right person. It may be a family member, it may be a friend, maybe the doctor, something like that. Then identifying when is to have the conversation rather than just jumping in and thinking you should stop or something like that. It's about actually having those conversations with people and actually identifying, right, maybe they're going to be taking the grandchildren more. And therefore, you might want to say, look, as you're taking the kids, let's have a chat about that. Maybe it's about something that's happened. There's been a road awareness campaign going on. Maybe there's been a collision that's happened. You've seen it in the news, something going on. It's a great way just to start those conversations about, what do you think we could all do in this sort of thing? So it's about finding the right time to start that conversation. And then, most importantly, is have a plan of what you're going to say to that person. What sort of questions you're going to ask them, what suggestions you're going to give them to which could help them. Because we need to be looking at things like, firstly, driving their ability. Maybe you want to encourage them to do an eyesight test, a hearing test. Maybe get them to go and check up with a GP. Maybe, we've had a brand new highway code that came out in January 2022. Maybe it's sit down and go through the highway code together and see what conversations come from that. It could be about sharing driving. We know that often older females are more likely to be involved in fatalities quite often than older males. And that's quite often because of the actual lack of experience, because we know husband and wife when they're driving, often the man will do the driving. So it's about making sure the sharing of the driving goes on. We MOT our cars, like I said earlier, we need to MOT ourselves. So a health check would be good and maybe checking with the GP. And the other thing, assessments, like I said, really great way just to brush up on your driving, maybe advise them about, I saw this assessment, mature driver assessment. How about doing that? And like I said, we're going to talk about that on Thursday.
I think you have some videos to show here, don't you, Rob, to illustrate perhaps how to have that conversation and possibly how not to.
Yeah, so I mean, basically, the first one, we're really pleased that these people have offered. We've had some people offer to do these films with their loved ones, and we really appreciate that they've helped us with this. And it's very difficult to have that conversation with someone. And the first video I'm going to play is just about how difficult it can sometimes be having that conversation.
At 83, Bill Perriam is still driving and enthusiastic about it too. But his health in recent years has begun to decline, meaning that his driving has been severely restricted. Bill and his son David consider how Bill's independence can be safely preserved for as long as possible.
So if you give up driving your car and you can't drive a motorbike, how do you think you get around?
Well, it should be dependent upon other people, I expect.
You get a senior citizens
Or have a
bus
taxi,
pass.
one thing or the other.
You can get a free bus pass, can't you?
I expect so, yes.
But you'd have to get to the bus stop, and that's a mile away, isn't it?
Yes.
But you'd be reliant on me, really, wouldn't you, most of the time, I expect?
More or less, I imagine, yes.
Yeah, well. But, I mean, you still think within yourself you're all right for another 2 or 3 years?
I'm hopeful that I should be driving till I'm 90 if I live that long.
That's another 7 years.
Easy, yeah.
Well, Mr. Barnes was driving when he was 90, but he kept driving into things.
Well, he wasn't very safe.
So if I was to say to you, I think the time's come when you're not safe to drive anymore, would you listen to me or would you ignore me?
Well, I would assess the situation and probably get expert opinion.
What, from somebody else?
Well, from the medical profession or whoever.
Or some expert in the field of driving. But you wouldn't listen to me, okay, would you?
Well, I'd listen to you, but I should weigh up the options myself and then proceed accordingly.
To do what you wanted?
Well, not necessarily, no. It would be a joint agreement.
But if we were to say you should stop driving, obviously we'd be doing it because we felt it was for your good, because we didn't want you to have an accident or you to have an accident that could hurt somebody else.
Everything comes to the end in its own time, so we just have to wait and see.
But you reckon you're still okay at the moment?
At the moment, yes.
So that was a good example, really, of just showing sometimes how it is difficult to have those conversations with people. And sometimes we can focus on the negatives rather than the positives, which can be a very difficult thing to have a conversation with people about. So I thought, James, what we'd do is share another video now. Now, this is one where basically somebody has also had a conversation with their loved one, and we're talking about the experience after it's happened, and it shows how sometimes what's happened in this one, they've had a good outcome as a result of it.
Roger Crisp realised that he and his brother and sisters would have to talk to their mother Muriel about her driving, partly because of the onset of dementia and partly because of a stroke that she'd suffered. It was a big step for Mrs. Crisp, as she had always driven as part of her work, and she was a qualified advanced driver. Now, a year and a half after dealing with the dangers, Roger and Muriel reflect on the difficulties posed by the conversation that they'd all had.
So making that decision really comes down to whether you're going to or not, doesn't it? It's your individual.
Oh yes. Nobody can make the decision for you, really. I don't think.
I remember we. Once that decision had been taken, one of the first things we did as children was to get the car sold, didn't we?
Well, yes. I said, get rid of it. Because I knew I'd want to drive.
What was Jennifer's reaction when you said you were?
Relief. Oh, Mum, good.
Looking back, do you think she was right?
Yes, she was. Entirely right, but right for me, you see, because that was, I mean, the stroke affects your brain in some way, and I feel sure that I shouldn't. I was glad I didn't drive after that, though I still miss it.
Of course, well, it's only been a year and a half, hasn't it, really?
Yes, but I've got a bus pass.
And you've got a driver.
Yes, now I've got a driver, of course.
I drive you. In fact, we enjoy going for drives, don't we?
Yes, we do. We enjoy it very much. We get to all over the place, and that's very nice.
That was Roger Crisp and his mother Muriel. Thank you to both sets of people for doing that and sharing that with us. Rob, I think we just need to kind of look at the resources, assessments or organisations that families can turn to for advice or support where they're concerned about an older driver's abilities. How can they access these?
Yeah, so we've got a website, Older Drivers Forum website. We have on there, we've got multiple pages that can help from people from giving advice to older drivers about how to keep driving safely for longer. And that's our tagline. But also we've got resources for GPs, optometrists, and families as well, mature driver families. And we've got lots of webinars like this today. We're recording all the webinars. They all go up on our website. We've got one about how to have those difficult conversations with a loved one, and that's about an hour webinar. We've got about the new highway code changes. So there's lots of little practical stuff as well. The important thing is if we are concerned about someone and those conversations are failing, what I would say is don't not do something about it. It's about we want, like I've always said, a car's a lethal weapon. If we're not fully in control of it, if someone is a danger, then what I would say is you could inform the police about it. There's also Crime Stoppers 0800 555 111, which is anonymous. But also you could just speak to their GP, make that awareness. But also we can, all of us, inform the DVLA. If you write to the DVLA, if it's a medical issue, they will do action on it. If it's just bad driving, that's not something they do. It's the police that deal with that. But what I would say is make sure that you do something about it. And as an older driver, we want to make sure that we're all fit and healthy to drive. And only by us having regular checks, not becoming complacent by our driving, making sure we have an eyesight test and a driving assessment, great way of making sure that we're fit.
Thank you very much for that, Rob Hurd. Now, Rob, stay there. We welcome back Sergeant Steve Broom. We have had loads of questions, and I think we're doing our best to answer them in writing, but let's just take a few minutes, literally, for the last part of this webinar, just to look at them. This question, please. I feel my decision making is not always as good as it was when I was younger. What's the best way to check this? I would like to improve and maybe find good techniques and strategies to maximize ability. Rob, do you want to take that?
Yeah, and I think that's the important one. And I think this is why we are currently creating a standardized mature driver assessment, because what we want to do is make sure people regularly do one of these. And a great incentive by having this standardized one is that what we will do is get it accredited, and hopefully then insurance companies would give discounted insurance. Now, we know many organizations across the country are offering these confidence building mature driver assessments. And that's what we would encourage people to go and get one of those to brush up on their skills. If you've got a medical condition, though, you should go to a driving mobility centre. But by speaking to a professional, like an approved driving instructor, is a great way to do it in a nice, relaxed, comfortable environment.
A question for Sergeant Steve Broom. I have briefly looked at the magazine site which does not have a high opinion of using particular types of glare reducing glasses. I'm wondering if the police have any useful experience they can pass on that, or anything that you'd like to say on that, Steve?
Not specifically with that. In relation to the eyesight tests, we do run regular operations where we will get people to do the 20-meter test with both their contact lenses and the spectacles that they've been issued with. It's really down to the driver about if they are confident in passing that test, and there's nothing stopping anybody pacing out 20 meters on the road and doing this themselves. Sometimes these will only come to an issue if there has been a collision. So there's personal responsibility really in this as well, I would say.
Thank you. Another question, are there specific tips for journey planning? We live in Herefordshire and we find journeys to family in Dorset and Southampton quite exhausting. Rob, a couple of
Yeah, so there's lots of, this is always a good thing, is to have a look online about where we're going. And basically you've got lots of things. There's various different apps. There's things like Google Maps, Waze, various different free apps that we can download, which is a great way of us planning our journey trips, for example. And actually you could put in the night before what time you wanted to get somewhere. It would calculate the journey for you and even send you a little reminder when to leave, because it knows what the traffic flow is like. So those are really useful little, using some of the technology we've got on there as well is a great way. But also one of the other things we recommend to people is what 3 words. There's an app that you can download. Now, if you broke down at the side of the road, quite often, a lot of people have not heard of it, use the What Three app, What Three Words app, and will give you 3 words which you could give to the emergency services or a breakdown service, and that will pretty much identify you in about a 100-meter location. And therefore, rather than thinking which road am I on, where I am, we can give that to the emergency services or breakdown service, and they'll come to you. So great way of thinking and planning in that, but also planning breaks. Plan in those stops, because as we age, we do get tired. A regular stop where you can get out, stretch your legs. Don't try and think of just doing one big journey. Plan in those regular stops as well.
Thank you, Rob. Last question to Sergeant Steve Broom. I suppose it's more of an observation. For an older driver, just some tips before setting off on a journey in terms of, like we check, we're encouraged to check the car for the tires and the oil and the water and all that kind of, but what about checking ourselves? It's so important, because then it would save you from a lot of stress and difficulty in responding to when things go wrong. Let's try and prevent them. Just a short checklist from you to help an older driver sort of stay safe.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, we have we call them powder checks: petrol, oil, water, and damage, or the rest of it. So for ourselves, in advanced driving, we talk a lot about mood, attitude, sleep, stress. If you're not in the right mind frame when you're setting off, things can go wrong quite quickly. Just take that few minutes to compose yourself before a journey, knowing the route that you're going on. As you've said, apps like Waze and Google Maps will tell you if there's a traffic delay. Remove the stress out of the journey yourself. Remove the distractions from the vehicle. If you're traveling with the same person, and potentially as you're getting older, perhaps not having the radio on or having these difficult conversations whilst you're driving. And it's just that self-awareness, really, I guess, which we all struggle with sometimes. But a lot of times when we go to collisions, it's down to speed, and it's down to, if the people had just taken it back 20%, it wouldn't have happened. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Sergeant Steve Broom, and thank you to Rob Hurd from the Older Drivers Forum. But that's just about all we have time for on this webinar. I do hope you'll be free to join us on Thursday next week at 2 o'clock, where our attention will turn to choosing the right car, understanding the technology, why a dash cam is such a sound investment, and generally how we can all stay independent for as long as possible. And with the number of older drivers holding full licenses at record highs, we'll consider the value of regular driving assessments. But for now, it just remains for me to thank Rob Hurd, Amanda Kilsby, Kate Walker, Sergeant Steve Broom from West Mercia Police, and to thank you for your company. From me, James Larkest, it's cheerio for now,